Hello, and thank you for a few short minutes of your time. Let me tell you a little bit about the Mountain States Regional Genetics Network. Who is Mountain States Regional Genetics Network, or MSRGN for short, you might ask? MSRGN is a regional network consisting of 8 states: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and we are funded federally by HRSA that funds the 7 regional genetics networks, which includes MSRGN, along with the Family Center and the National Coordinating Center. The mission of the regional genetics networks is to increase access to genetic services for individuals and their families, including those who are underserved in our region. In 2021, Mountain States Regional Genetics Network selected 8 individuals who had navigated the genetic journey for their own loved ones in their own state. These individuals became our Genetic Navigators and are now available to help families navigate genetics. Genetic Navigators offer resources, guidance, and navigation to others from a perspective of someone who has been there and done that and has been on a genetics path and journey for their own loved ones. Sometimes we all just need a helping hand. The ultimate goal of the program is navigating to hope for families who may be filled with questions, who may be looking for resources, or who may be experiencing barriers to accessing genetic services in their state. Anyone who has ever been on a genetics journey has been filled with questions. Today, we will be sharing questions that our own genetic navigators had when they first started navigating for their own families.
I think the biggest question I had when we first started thinking about what we needed from the genetics world was how to get that genetics referral. My son had Down syndrome diagnosis at birth, and so the idea that we would need to revisit genetics was hard for some of the specialists to wrap their brains around, but because he was declining rapidly and no one could come up with a solution, trying to navigate that route to getting the actual referral was more difficult than I had anticipated. So that advocacy piece of being able to say, this is why I want genetics for my son and why I think it will be helpful. I think those were the questions that if I had been more prepared to answer, maybe I would have been able to get the referral a little easier.
So I didn't have a big question starting out the genetics journey with my family. Having worked in healthcare and worked with kids with many of the known genetic disorders. So I was fairly confident that my children didn't have one of the known disorders. And I was skeptical that we would even find anything since whole exome and whole genome sequencing weren't available at the time. My main concern was getting some sort of diagnosis or report that would allow me to get services for my children, insurance coverage, and to find direction in how to help them.
This question I have all throughout the process, but a part of the process that stands out to me is when we had just started our genetic testing journey, and I started conversing with other rare families and went to an international or a national conference on rare disease. And I started to learn that not all hospitals were the same, not all doctors were the same. And so that became my question, is like, how do I know what's really available to my child for genetic testing? Because I'm realizing then that it depends on the doctor and what they want to offer, and of course insurance. And so I had to do some research. I still don't think I could completely answer that question.
I think my biggest question was, what now? Which feels very broad, but with our condition, there was so many things to plan and do. We went from, just having some very general therapeutic services to needing so many specialists, to needing to add insurances, to figuring out access to doctors who even knew what his condition was. And it felt very overwhelming. We had not, thought about genetics. We weren't looking for a genetic diagnosis. So I didn't think genetics until the day that we got our diagnosis for our son when he was 1. So you don't just get hit with your kid has this condition, you get hit with, and now we've got to do this, and we've got to apply for this insurance, and we've got to put all these things in place. And so that first couple of months was just so overwhelming. And then treatment too, treatment was very overwhelming with all of the things that we suddenly knew that he needed, and he needed it now.
I think the biggest question I had was my daughter was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. So they use what's called a sweat test. It's sort of the standard test for diagnosing CF. And it's just they collect sweat and they measure how much chloride. And then infants, young children who have really high levels, that's a positive for probably having CF. And then my daughter had genetic testing. So I'll say going into genetic testing, I was just so relieved to have a diagnosis because she was a really sick little baby. I was just so relieved. And when they did the genetic testing and then came back and told me these letters and numbers, Delta F508, I wanted to know, what does that mutation, how does that impact her? Because cystic fibrosis, at that time, they knew there were hundreds of different genetic mutations that cause CF. Now they know there's at least 2,000. And I wanted to know, so this mutation correlates with what? Like genotype, phenotype. This mutation correlates to what severity of disease? So I had questions about that. And then I had questions, I think like most moms, what can I do? What can I do to keep her healthy? What can I do to make sure she lives as long as she can and has the best quality of life? Those were my biggest questions.
I appreciate the opportunity to think about this question. It took 12 years for us to diagnose my daughter, and the whole time we were working with genetics. So the biggest question I started to have was, what happens, or how do we proceed when you have a person who you think has a genetic diagnosis, but every year and every test you do comes back with no answer? And for us, that was to do the whole exome sequencing.
Thank you for your time today in listening to our video. If you would like to connect with the Genetic Navigator for your state, please go to the Mountain States website, www.mountainstatesgenetics.org/GN. There you will find our 8 genetic navigators and their email address, and you can reach out to them and contact them that way. In addition, if you have further questions about Mountain States or would like to connect with our network, please reach out to us on the Contact tab at our website. We'd also like to thank our funders, HRSA, for their support of our program.